Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
If you don't like to read, you haven't found the right book.
Hello and welcome to Sundoku, the podcast for abibliophobics everywhere. I'm Michaela Andreou.
And I'm Cath Keneally. And what is an abibliophobic? Pray tell.
I'm just showing off. It's a person who fears running out of reading material.
Oh, well, that's me. And genuinely, that's me.
Really?
I get very twitchy if there's not another book waiting for when I finish the one that I'm on.
Well, you are on the right podcast then, Cath. You're at home.
Just as well.
Now, Cath, you've heard of TikTok, haven't you?
Yes.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, did you know there's BookTok?
No. Is this new?
Yeah, well, apparently it's been around since 2020 and I just cottoned on yesterday. So, 3 years, that's not too bad for me, really.
You're beating me.
Anyway, it's driving massive young adult book sales. And booksellers, at least in the UK, where I was reading a Guardian UK article, reported to love it. And this month is the inaugural BookTok Book Awards that they're going to be announced.
Okay, well, how will that work?
Well, users who use the platform are just going to be voting for Best Book, and I think they did this back in May. And predictably, there's going to be Best Book Influencer. But in a nice twist for social media, they're also voting on Best Independent Bookseller, and Books to End a Reading Slump, and Best TikTok Revival. That's sort of like our classic section. The contenders include Pride and Prejudice, and Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go is also a contender. So we'll find out this month who's winning.
That is fabulous. I would say we're up there in the book influencers category, wouldn't you?
Oh, definitely. There's a lot of, young adult book readers that listen to us, Cath. They are loving us, fully sick.
So if I'm looking for a good young adult read, these are the books I go for.
Yeah, exactly.
Suggest.
I think BookTok's the place to find out,
All
what
right.
they're all reading. And it looks like they're also launching a publishing house, which is going to be called Eighth Note Press. And they've poached an editor from Penguin Random House, and they're going to get their own romance and fantasy and, a youth-style sort of line of books going.
All of that online, do we imagine, or what?
Well, that's what I'm thinking. Probably, yeah. We're not hip enough to know these things.
We'll have to talk to them sometime on the podcast. And meanwhile, what new book are you bringing us this week, Michaela?
All right, back to us. So a little while ago, I spoke to Catherine Therese about her novel, Things She Would Have Said Herself. Now, this centres on Leslie and Wallace Bird, and I really couldn't go past this review in the Saturday paper, which I love reading, which sums it up. Leslie Bird disapproves of the world. Specifically, gay people, trans people, Muslims, curly hair, exposed décolletages, and everything that her husband and her children do. Sometimes she keeps her disapproval to herself, but mostly she doesn't.
My publisher said to me when I first, handed her the manuscript, this is about that generation we all roll our eyes at, but we're devastated when they're gone.
Okay, let's get on to our classic for this week. We've all heard of the Bloomsbury set and the Hyson Art School. We've heard of movements like Baroque and Impressionists. But Cath, I understand you're going to introduce us to a uniquely Australian and very significant group of artists who started their own movement.
And I think people will probably be familiar with the name of the movement, but maybe not with the Gang of Four, as they were known in the 70s. They were central to the formulation of a radical new form of desert art, Papunya Tula. And they should be as well known as any of the whitefellow greats. And in his book, Dot, Circle and Frame, John Keane explains exactly why. So, Michaela, tell me about the interview you did things she would have said herself by Catherine Therese. I gather it was a pretty emotional chat.
Yeah, it absolutely was. The book centres on Leslie Bird. Now, she is a rude, cantankerous, repressed, pretty unattractive woman. The story also includes her sister Martha, her husband Wallace, their children, their grandchildren. None of them are really any nicer than Leslie. It's dark, it's funny, it's shocking, and it's unlike any book I can ever recall reading. It's also about the trauma that shapes difficult people and how it permeates through generations. It's not an easy read, but I have to say it really is a clever one. So I started the interview by telling Catherine that, well, her characters really don't welcome you with a smile, and the reader really has to trust that she is going to take them somewhere worth going.
You're spot on. I'm asking a lot of the reader to lean in and stay with me through the really sad, scary in the sense that it's so unsettling, the way these people are formed and the way they treat one another. And it makes me think about one of my favourite writers, David Grossman, talks about, this instinctive, wild, chaotic stuff that's inside us and how terrified we are of it. And I am attempting to throw all that open and let these people say what it is they're thinking. And there's a quote that's right at the front of the book by Muriel Rukeyser, which is, "If one woman told the truth of her life, the world would split open." And it was very much on my mind. And very grateful for people who do stick with the book and read through it, because the reward, I hope, is to feel less judgment, to feel some compassion. And I guess I've got a fairly good threshold. I grew up in a pretty chaotic family myself. Asking readers to surrender to that and come on this journey with this family. I'm hoping that you're forced to make judgments, and then those judgments are kind of pulled apart when you come to realise the reasons why things happen, the cause and the consequences of a lot of loss and a lot of grief and a lot of wackiness, a lot of craziness in this family.
You say in the acknowledgements, which I really enjoyed reading, you're trying to understand the lives of others, even if they're vastly different to our own, is still the best way of building empathy.
I do hope that. I hold dearly to that, Michaela. As difficult as the book may be to digest, because of some of the shocking storylines in it, I can tell you it was more shocking to write and to inhabit these characters. It took more than a decade. And I started off actually with Wallace Bird, not Leslie Bird, the main character. And I had a dream about a little boy called Wallace in a field of wheat. Wheat was all that he could see. And I just started writing scenes, started writing about this little boy. And I think maybe I was right trying to understand my parents' generation. They're from the country, from the Riverina. I actually placed Wallace in Grenfell, which is an ode to Henry Lawson. He had an enormous impact on me as a child reading. I didn't really understand what I was reading when I grabbed Lawson. Mum used to take us to the library, and mostly to get away from my sisters. They were all kind of clustered in the one area. In the children's books, I took off to the poetry section. Yeah. And, I borrowed all sorts of big poetry books and started writing poetry. But there was something in the rhythm of Lawson and the melancholy, the sadness that I was experiencing, and it was the vernacular. I recognised the dialect of my people in Lawson, the old bastards from the country. And so, I started with Wallace, and I guess, Wallace needed a wife at some stage. And then Leslie Bird came along, and I introduced the characters to my parents very, very early on in the writing process, I think as a way of ensuring that I had created these separate entities, and Dad was very fond of them before he passed. At the same time, bewildered, completely bewildered by me and my need to, name things. He used to say to me, "Oh, she likes to think of herself as an artiste."
Well, that line is in the book, isn't it? Caroline, one of the sisters, is a painter, and Wallace does say that.
Yeah, I think, whilst the content of the book's fiction, the concerns are mine, and I have cast Carolyn as a bit of an avatar, I guess, for myself, in the sense that she's an artist. She's someone who's trying to make something, and also playing with that sort of meta ideology of, she's a visual artist, she's painting what she thinks or what she tells everyone are portraits, but they're actually very, very explosive content about her family, and yet she gets furious when they see themselves in her work. And I was having a go at writing about all of those things. And I guess all fiction it's what's in our DNA, isn't it? It's the things that have left their traces in us over, decades.
At some point, obviously, Leslie has taken over in your focus. So at what point does she become the focus of the book and not Wallace?
When I started thinking about who he would have married, and, Wallace is a hapless character. He's not as cantankerous as Leslie, but he's very clumsy with the things he says. He's well-intentioned, but he's very ignorant. Left school at 15, had his teeth pulled out, started a trade and smoking on the same day. And that's true for Leslie too. They both left school really early. So their education thereafter was the lives that they were living, and they were very contained lives. They didn't travel beyond, there's a couple of trips to Queensland in the book, but other than that, they're very parochial. And my publisher said to me when I first, handed her the manuscript, this is about that generation we all roll our eyes at, but we're devastated when they're gone. And it is about those people, and this is my attempt to try to understand where some of those ideas and values have come from. I've always been friends with a lot of older people. My life's had a funny old shape. I had my first child at 16 and didn't have peers my own age for a number of years. I was at home with mum and my grandparents, and I've always had a fondness for elderly people. When I was at school and we had to do, what's that called? Work experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were given 2 weeks, and I did 1 week in media at Dolly magazine. So I was, trying to get in the door. Yeah, trying to get in the door with the writing. And then the second week was at a nursing home. Yeah. These preoccupations have been with me for a long time. My love and bafflement, and they exist simultaneously. How could these people be thinking these things? They tell me all the time how frightened they are to speak. People of Leslie and Wallace's generation. I mean, they do say dreadful things. They think dreadful things, but there's reasons for that. And I'm trying, I guess, obliquely to show that and to resist judgment myself, to let them be on the page and say all these things and see what happened.
When I was reading, I was thinking, tell me how I'm supposed to feel about these people, because I don't know. And you don't do that. The storytelling takes over, though, and within the story you start to understand them better. It's funny. I have not a dissimilar family as well, quite a sort of large, crazy family. And you don't understand them all the time, but you do have this sense of tribe. They're your people. I used to sort of say to my husband sometimes, oh, I love my crazy family. And sometimes he'd say to me, it's actually not right what's going on here. This is pretty weird stuff. But you grow up in it, so you want that other person to understand that they're not all bad. They come from a place. There's a reason for this. I understand it because I've lived it. So I think for me that's what your book really beautifully and wonderfully does. It's an incredible book. Just
thank you.
it's unrelenting in its mission, I feel, to expose these people and let the reader decide. But ultimately, I do feel your warmth near the end of the book. You almost give us that ending that we're hoping for. Was there a part of you that it did at the end want us to sort of really empathise a lot more deeply with these people?
Oh, all the way through. I think it's just, if you don't mind me going back, Michaela, to what you said, I think it's quite profound what you said, that you love your crazies and your partner's pointing out that, that this isn't normal and things are inexcusable, and you can still love people that do dreadful things. And there are moments of redemption for all of these characters in the book. What fascinated me when you asked me before about how did Leslie become sort of central to the book, I guess the notion I kept getting sort of drilling down closer and closer to the notion of perceptions, how vastly different we can see ourselves and how other people see us, and not just as individuals then, but as generations. That my parents' generation, Mum said to me the other day, oh, that LGBTQ thing, why can't they put an O and a U on the end? And I said, oh, what do you mean? And she said, others and us, because she feels so marginalised and judged and so diminished.
Yes.
Mum's a beautiful person, and I ache for her not being able to pay at the doctors, and because she can't use cash and all these terrible things. And I guess I just wanted to give a voice to those people who are leaving us and taking their language and ideas, however wacky and misplaced they seem, to create a space for that.
And it's interesting you say that once you understand these characters a bit better, it also gives you as an individual an opportunity to understand yourself better and to maybe break the cycle of some of that craziness where you say, well, if I am prepared to name all of these things and look at them without any sort of rose-tinted glasses whatsoever, maybe I can accept things for what they are and break the cycle myself. Do you feel that that's at the stage you're at?
I've always loved them, and forgiveness was never a question for me. I think when you grow up, I have to try not to cry. Yeah. But with my dad, he had a nickname for me, which was Og Dog. He used to read little comic strip, and there was Doggy Daddy and Og Dog. And I didn't find out until I was, probably in my 40s, that Og Dog was actually the father of the child. It was that thing of the child was actually leading the father. And so there was an acknowledgement of that. I was Dad's buddy. I used to stay with him during awful long nights when he was drunk, and he would tell me stories about his sadness. He had shocking depression, and when you're exposed to that, it is, for me, I mean, I would love to have felt less afraid and more hopeful, to not live with my shoulders up around my ears. I'm still a very vigilant person because of all of that, but I think it's also where my empathy was born, that like Whitman had birdsong. I used to sit behind Dad's chair scratching his head while he listened to the races, and I would just try to soothe him and console him. And really, there wasn't anything for me to forgive. I understood the sadness. Dad came from generations of alcoholics on both sides of his family. I'm enough of an addict in the sense that, I don't know, my husband and children would probably argue that writing's not a healthy obsession, but that's where I've placed my obsessive nature, is on the page. And when you say things like it's relentless, I am.
It is.
I guess I am.
People, you call books.
It helps me.
You sometimes, I'll call book rich in detail, and it is rich in detail. It's fabulous. The language, the phrases, there is so much in there. But the word that does come to mind is that it is relentless. It's at you from day one, this book.
Yes.
And I loved it. I have no complaints about that, but it's interesting that you say it's almost a compulsive sort of style. I was likening it a little bit to Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, with that sort of stream of consciousness style, because there's times where you just pivot, like a mind jumps, so does the narrative. Is that a fair enough description of the style?
Oh, that's a beautiful thing to say. She's a huge inspiration for me. I felt, especially during the sections of dialogue in the book, that I really wasn't there. I'd come out after a day's writing and I really felt like I was nothing to walk around as Leslie Bird for 10 years. I said that to my husband recently. He said to me, tell me about it. Do you think next time you could write a book about a woman who wants to have sex with her husband all the time? But I think when you say about that, that thing that Woolf does so well, that sort of skating in and out of consciousnesses, it felt like playing a game of doubles, but there was sort of 16 people on the court and I was serving and returning constantly.
I can see
and
that.
I don't write in any linear fashion. I write scenes and I have no idea. I think there's 120,000 words or something in the book, but there's sort of 5 times that in draft. And if you imagine that as a jigsaw puzzle and sort of throw them all down on the floor, and they're all little scenes, for years I just felt like I had sky and grass. I didn't know. I never know what I'm doing. But I'm faithful to that, the not knowing.
Yeah.
I'm faithful to the writing process and turning up and putting my bum in the seat and just seeing what comes out, and then the really hard work of trying to make sense of it all. And I hope I have.
Did it take a lot out of you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it really did, particularly the loss. I mean, the things that kind of reverberate, the losses in the book, Leslie Bird, I don't think it's a spoiler because you read it on the back of the book that she's lost a child. It's agonising to write about that. I haven't lost a child, but when I was 16 and had my son in a very repressed situation, a woman was brought into the ward, very heavily pregnant. She was overdue, and she was brought in the night before she was going to be induced, and they brought her into my room, and the nurses asked if she could hold my baby, and it transpired that she'd lost 9 children, 9 babies, and this was her 10th baby. And it just never left me. She left the next morning, to be induced, and she never came back to the room. And nurses came and went the following day, and I asked them, and I mean, their attitude towards me largely was, oh, you're a baby who's had a baby. And, there was a lot of shame around it, and I wasn't treated kindly, although at the time I thought that it was just fine, that I deserved to be treated that way. Anyway, that's another story. But this poor woman, she never came back to the ward, and eventually a pink lady said to me, and if you've read the book, so you'll understand the resonance here. The pink lady said to me, oh, when she came to do the tea and biscuits, baby born blue. And then a day later, this woman's husband came and asked me if I would come and visit her. And I did. I went, they put her on the general ward, which I suppose, where do they put people when they lose babies? And, there was all these people having had appendix taken out and all sorts of things. And here was this woman with a belly still huge and no baby. And here am I, with a baby that I hadn't tried to have but had, and she asked me if she could have my child. And he's 40 now. I didn't give him away, but I've lit a candle for that little baby for the last 40 years. The day after my son's birth, the 18th of August, I light a candle for that baby every year. And so that's been running around my heart for decades, and I think that's where Leslie Bird's loss came from. So when you ask, does it take a lot out of you, you're bringing things up. Your unconscious is pulling all these strands together to create stories, to tell deeper truths about things that have left their traces in you, things that you've paid attention to. And, yeah, it's gruelling. It's really gruelling. Joyful when it all comes together. And I hope it has. And I hope, these characters aren't politically correct. They're anything but. And I just sort of hope that we're slowly coming to realise that sometimes when we think we're protecting one group of people, we might be hurting other people. Mum saying, oh, can they put a U on the end, for us, because she feels unheard and unseen now and useless. That's the word she uses all the time. I feel useless. And they're anything but, and they do say terrible things, and they've come from very, very different lives. And I think the more shade and nuance and dimension and context that we can think about each other in, the better off we're all going to be.
If Catherine Therese's story has moved you and you feel like taking on this rich and unique book that basically hits you over the head in more ways than one, Things She Would Have Said Herself may just be the next book for your sundoku.
We're going to move now to a form of writing that I don't think we've focused on before, and that is writing about art, which is, well, it's an easy thing to do if you're talking to a converted audience who speak the same language. But John Keane is trying to introduce us to the four major figures who were central to the formation of the Papunya Tula desert art movement. He actually lived with these guys, Kappa, Jumper Jimper, Tim Chapaljari, Clifford Possum and Johnny Chuparula, in the late 70s when he was out there on that settlement as a very young arts worker. And then he moved to Tandanya, the National Cultural Institute for Aboriginal Art, as the first exhibitions curator. He's been thinking about that, keeping up that connection all this time, and particularly thinking about what formed those four men, their lives. And in Dot, Circle and Frame, he tells us about their pivotal space and what formed them as stockmen and labourers and then artists.
What I try to do in the book is put the Papunya painters in a kind of broader historical context of painting in Central Australia, going from, really I started about 1900, but intensely in about 1928, because there are a couple of key events in Central Australia that really kind of shattered the old way of living and made it critical that Aboriginal people adjust to a new regime of working and living alongside white people, either in a pastoral situation or on a mission, say Nataria, Hermannsburg, Fink River Mission.
That Hermannsburg painting, the watercolour painting, the school of painting that came out of there through association with the Hermannsburg missionaries and so on, was becoming moderately well known in white Australia.
A few things happened, like the train went right through to Alice Springs, I think it was in the late 20s, and the pioneer buses went out to Hermannsburg from Alice Springs from around 1930, I think. And there was a young man at Hermannsburg who had camels. He'd had a lot of experience working with camels and was interested in people, outgoing. It was a guy called Albert. He didn't have the name Albert Namatjira at that time. That was his father's name. And he was a guide to artists who would go to Palm Valley, which is 5 or 6 kilometres from the mission. He'd guide people out there. Palm Valley was his mother's place. He took various artists out there over years and watched them work, took it all in. He was a great learner of all sorts of skills, and his interest in art grew during that period. And then a little bit later, he learned the watercolour technique from Rex Batterby.
When we're talking about dot paintings, you would think that was something entirely different and from a different source and needing to be decoded in a completely different way. But last night you were talking about the interconnection of the coming together of those two schools, if they are schools. What's that story?
In the history of writing about Central Australian art, the landscape tradition that started at Hermannsburg Mission and the dot and circle tradition, for want of a better word, which started in 1971 at Papunya, were looked at as very independent schools. One was sort of associated with the assimilation policy of the 1940s and 50s and 60s, and the other is more associated with the self-determination policy that followed on and was a kind of a marker of that. But a lot of the key individuals who started Papunya Tula painting were really closely related. They were Mudjara men that were closely related to Western Aranda people who were the custodians of the watercolour tradition. So they're related by marriage. They were related by the songs lines that connected the two countries. and they're also related by their historical experiences. What I tried to do was look at the lesser known places, if you like Haas Bluff, and see where those two groups of people were living together. You know, the stations that they worked on together, the camel tracks that they shared, you know, the ration depots that they interacted at, and also the ceremonial grounds that they both shared at different times. So when you look at the kind of history of Central Australian art from a kind of place-based perspective, you see that there are all sorts of interactions between people who have been treated as separate and different, and dealing with really different aspects of art. But actually, dig deeper, and there's all sorts of thematic connections between the Namajira's choice of sites to paint and the choice of sites to paint by the Papunya painters.
Tell us about those 4 men in particular that you focus on in the book.
Yeah, well, if I could just sort of go out a little bit from that to place that in context, is the Papunya movement in 1971 and 72 was driven by 20 people or so, and they were from various language groups over a wide area. What I've done is just focus on 4 artists. 3 of them were a Madjira, that's their language, and one was a Pindabi man who was kind of connected by marriage and by songline to those other 4, because they seem to me driving a different kind of art, using the same materials in very frequently the same icons, but they were thinking in quite a different way about what they were producing. So the 4 artists are Kapa Jambi Jimba, Tim Lura Jabaljari, Clifford Possum Jabaljari, and Johnny Warangula Jubarula. Kapa was the first leader of the Papunya painting, and he initiated a new kind of painting in 1971, in the winter of 1971, and it's very unfamiliar to most appreciators of desert art. It looks quite different. It's figurative. The icons are often placed on a black background or a red background. There's no dotted infill, and it has a kind of curious perspective to it. It's like Kapa's distanced himself at a visual sense, but he's absolutely confident about what he's doing because he performs in these ceremonies. He sings the verses that the icons relate to. He's in charge of the ceremonies that he's painting.
Yeah.
So there's this wonderful period where Kapa initiated a new kind of painting. He actually won an award in Alice Springs, the Caltex Art Award, in August of 1971, and sold 7 or 8 paintings in that weekend. When he got the money in Papunya, he went to the store and conspicuously bought, a side of lamb and a big box of groceries, and that moment was recorded in a photograph. Everybody noticed that Kapa had made some good money from painting, and that sparked a huge interest amongst other men in the potential of doing this new kind of painting.
Yeah, and you got the men's painting room set
Yes,
up.
Yeah, well, that happened a little bit later. Kapa had his own studio in the old settlement office, which had been abandoned, and Kapa took it over, and other men would come and work with him there. They generally got their own materials there, so they'd go to building sites or the tip, get old bits of fibroboard, lino, hardboard, cupboard doors, whatever, get paints from building sites or the school, steel paint brushes from the school, whatever they needed to do. And so that there was this sort of small group of about 6 or 7 artists who would work there for a few months. And then it was only later in that year, after Kapa's work came to notice and the potential of a new kind of painting and a new industry, a new Aboriginal industry at Papunya, was recognised, that the the eastern end of the old town hall was made available for them, and that became what is really probably the most important studio in Australian art history, at least in my opinion.
And these men had worked as stockmen and labourers prior to this. They were familiar with comic books, pencils and paper, maps, these things. So it wasn't a huge transition. Well, it was a transition from ceremonial art to paint on wood and paint on canvas, but, that there'd already been that interface.
They were contemporary people.
That's
They
right.
were living in the modern age. They were working in a cash economy, and they were also incredibly curious men. Carper, Tim, and Clifford had extraordinary curious minds, and they took all sorts of opportunities to learn new things and engage with this sort of popular culture that was sweeping across the globe. So it's one of the things that I bring into the discussion that I think has been left out, because the focus has always been on this is Aboriginal art of First Nations, and not about modern art that came out of people's cross-cultural experience and their intercultural experience with, movies of, cowboys, all that kind of stuff. So all of those ways of seeing were influencing and gave these artists the capacity to kind of tighten up the picture plane, if you like, and to approach it in quite a formal way that in some instances, as you say, comes directly out of cartooning, sometimes out of ethnographic photographs. Those books, famous books like Spencer and Gillen's Native Tribes of Central Australia, were circulating not just amongst whitefellas in Central Australia. They were in the Papunya School library, and the school teachers had them in their houses, and they were discussed over cups of tea. So there's this sort of growing recognition, I think, of the Indigenous subject as something that whitefellas were interested in, and not only they were interested in it, they would pay for it. So Carper, Tim and Clifford were all fantastic carvers. They made realistic polychromatic sculptures before they became painters. They were accomplished artists working to a market before they became painters.
When they were first putting those things together for sale, those guys included material, themes, motifs from ceremonies that later came to be regarded as secret and not actually supposed to be out there in the public domain. And so you've reproduced one of those paintings by Kappa, I think, where you can only actually reproduce a fragment of it because it's later been judged to be too secret to be out there.
Yeah. Well, Kappa is a really challenging personality. I mean, he was an outgoing person. He was regarded as a troublemaker by whitefellas, but he also stretched the limits of traditional culture. He was making art for a new time. He knew that culture was changing in all sorts of ways. New dances were being developed that brought men and women into the same ground. He did the same kind of thing with visual art. And occasionally he went too far. By his own admission, he went too far. And those images, many of which are in the museums and art gallery of the Northern Territory, can't be shown.
John, how much of the book do you spend engaging theoretically with the art?
I guess it's woven right throughout. What I tried to do with the book is to always put it in its historic context. So the chapters are roughly chronological, and they deal with the kind of big moments of what's happening in people's lived experience at that time, whether it's missions, whether it's the Coniston massacre that happened at around where Tim and Clifford and Carper lived, or whether it's becoming stockmen. So the kind of art theory is placed within people's lived experience and is not separate from it. The book's divided into two major parts. One is before Papunya, the Hermannsburg mission, and deal with the overland telegraph line and those sorts of major events that happened, and the intersection of the people who would make Papunya painting. And then the second half of the book is about how it was actually created at Papunya and the major protagonists. So it's the part where I suppose I break down Papunya painting into its component parts, what it is to paint on a square surface, for instance, how that differs from painting on the body or on the ground or on a shield. Strangely, it's not something that's been discussed in the literature of Central Australian art, but it was a really major challenge, and particularly Kappa and Tim Lura said about it in a really formal way. They almost created a kind of laboratory for the analysis of how to fit oval objects onto a square board or a rectangular board.
The frame.
Yeah,
they got
frame.
that.
They got it. They understood that you had to frame these things, and they picked it up from watching Namatjira painting and watching his sons and his nephews painting. And then one of the other key parts is the dot. These elements are sort of taken for granted in a sense, but they were transposed from customary contexts where they were applied to the body or the shield or whatever three-dimensional moving active thing onto a fixed element. And that's really where Johnny Warringoola comes into it, because I argue that he's the inventor of the articulate dot. Dots are always in Central Australian art, but usually they were used to emphasise the edge of an object, like dotting around an object to make it brighter and stronger, or kind of an infill of one colour to cover a whole surface. What Johnny Warringoola did was to discover that you could use the dot to create and enhance a narrative, to talk about phenomena. And he did that through a series of paintings about rain dreaming, water dreaming, and an ancestral storm. So his paintings became totally immersive as being at the moment of the creation of a storm, with thunder, lightning, hailstones crashing around, running water, and bringing all these phenomena in, and using kind of small dots, big dots, layering of dots to emphasise how not just the kind of symbols for water, but the whole experience of being a storm.
To wind up, John, what has the influence of these main four guys been through the decades since you were there in the late 70s, and what's going on at Papunya now?
Okay, there's probably two questions there.
Yes, two questions there.
The first is about the influence, and one of the things I do in the book is try to separate Central Australian art from the art of the Western Desert. Now, they've been conflated quite often as though they were the same thing. So I don't talk in the book about what's happened in the kind of amongst Pindabi and Pindara, Ngarrindjara people of the Western Desert, who really had a whole different approach to painting. I talk about Central Australia, and there the Amudjara painters have had a really profound influence. If you think of that, the art of the circle and that kind of really basic iconography of circles and small U-shapes to represent figures and dots for emphasis and layering, that's become a national iconography in lots of ways. Yeah. Kids learn it at school. It's plastered on all sorts of merchandise, either produced by Aboriginal people or appropriated in some way. So it's gone into the art of Central Australia, and some of the formal devices, the kind of symmetry that the Amudjara painters brought has been a really strong influence, and that's around kind of fitting the iconography onto a rectangle in a really tight and tightly conceptualised way. So they've had enormous influence. It's gone from being a fairly arcane reference in a few scholarly books to being a national iconography and a kind of internationally recognised symbol of Australia. So that had a pretty profound effect. So I'd argue that they're some of the most influential artists to have worked in Australia, and their works have all sorts of layers of complexity beyond that make them not only influential but also worth looking at in detail as individual artists for their own, where they go, what their interests are, because they're all really, really different.
John Keane, a writer and curator, and his book is Dot, Circle and Frame, about the Papunya Tula Art movement.
This is Sundoku, the podcast for people who've named their dog Banjo, their cat Aslan, and their firstborn Darcy.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Cath Keneally.
And I'm Michaela Andreev. Happy reading and catch you next time.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Cath Keneally.
Michaela Andreev.
Sarah Martin.
And me, Annie Hastwell. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to know more about the books and authors featured in this episode, check out the show notes. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SundokuCast. That's TSUNDOKU cast.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.